Well, hello. So again, this is the first video lecture for Psych 4451 for this term. So I just want to remind you, I would have already talked about this last week with you during our live first class meeting, but please remember that these video recordings are for your use only for this term. They are not to be distributed. They are not to be saved. They are not to be loaded onto anything. But basically, this was the best way I could make sense of how to have this class happen this term, excuse me, in this method of alternate delivery. So what's going to happen today is, and then for every future week, is you're going to get a link to these videos. The link to Google Drive will be posted in Blackboard, and you will be able to watch at your own pace, leisure, whatever. There will be times where I will tell you in the video to go ahead and pause the video because there will be those reflection questions that we talked about coming up. There will also be times where I will expect you to click through to a link. I'm not clicking through to all the links, whether it's for something written or whether it's a YouTube video, just in the interest of time on these videos, but in your PowerPoint slides, you will have active links for all those things when I tell you to go ahead and go there. The other thing I just want to let you know is that the reflection questions come up somewhat randomly. They're not at all in a set pattern, and they are not in the PowerPoint slides that you have. So the reflection questions are going to show up on these videos, and that's it. So please do make sure you are watching the videos through and getting to all of the reflection questions, and those, again, are due right before class each week. The idea, again, being that you're going to get some of the content here, and between what you get from this video lecture, your textbook, and any other supplemental reading, mean that when we meet live, we can have a much better discussion and make better use of that time, since we have more limited time in a lot of ways this term, even though we're doing this alternate delivery. So this first video is probably not going to be the most exciting. I find in this course, getting through the first few chapters is some of it is reviewed from lifespan and from topics in child development and from research methods and every other psych class you've ever taken before in your life. But I also feel like we have to just make sure everybody's coming from the same place, the same starting point for this class. So please just bear with me. We will get through it, and then things will get progressively more and more interesting as we go along in the course, okay? So we're starting with chapter 2. We talked a little bit last week in our first class meeting about, just the introduction to the course in chapter 1. So we're going to dive right in. And we're going to start by talking about some of these theoretical foundations. Also, just again as a reminder, I do tend to have the slide headings follow along with your text. So if you are following along with your text while you're watching this, or if you want to go back and get more clarification, it should be easy enough for you to find where you are in your text by looking for the headings on the slides and going to match them up. Okay, so one of the things that's really important, again, we're talking about atypical child development, or the slightly less wordy or differently wordy is abnormal child psychology. So throughout this course, we're going to be talking about disorders of childhood from a mental health perspective, and some that start in childhood and go on into adulthood. I will have mentioned this last week as well, but again, in case anybody added late with add drop, just a reminder that because I am a clinical psychologist by training, I teach this class from a clinical perspective. There are other people, so in the past few years, both Dr. Nancy Ogden and Dr. Mitch Clark have taught this class as well, and they have taught it from more of a developmental perspective. There's no right or wrong way to teach it, and in fact, we all use the same textbook, so the same basic information, but we each come at it a little bit differently. So if you were hoping to get this class from a more developmental perspective as opposed to a more clinical perspective, you're kind of out of luck because I'm the only one teaching it this year, but in future years, there could be someone else teaching it from a slightly different perspective. But just please try to keep that in mind, that I'm coming at this as a clinical psychologist, not as a developmental psychologist. So that being said, one of the things that's really important for us to remember when we're talking about abnormal child psychology is the developmental level of the child. And there are things that are normal at one age or expected at one age that would be problematic at a different age. And that's one of the reasons that knowing how old a child is and where they are developmentally, whether they've been hitting all their milestones, becomes really important when we're assessing them, because something that may not give us pause at one age would give us great pause at a later age. And just as a quick, easy example, you'll find in this class, I'll end up using my own child as an example a lot of the time, simply because I have a child and I'm teaching a course about children. And it's just easy that way. She is now 5, and one of the things in the last year or two that has happened sometimes is sometimes when she's frustrated, so at 3 and at 4, when she would get frustrated, sometimes she would hit. Never her friends, very interesting. Like, we never got reports at daycare, but at home, sometimes she would hit me or hit her dad and just sort of a like, go away, right? Like, I need my space. At her age, we tell her that's not nice, use your words, don't hit, but we're not overly concerned. If she was 13 and still hitting us to tell us to go away, that's developmentally less appropriate, right? So we have to think about some of these things of, is this okay for now, and how do we deal with it so it doesn't become a problem later on, or is this absolutely not okay behavior? So that's part of what we're going to be thinking about. So what we have to keep in mind from a developmental psychopathology perspective is that, first of all, abnormal development is multiply determined. And you might be thinking, what does that mean? Well, and really what that means is we have to look at a wide range of possible contributions. Abnormal development in a child, or in anybody, it's not one thing caused it, right? So even when we think about a disorder like PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, where we know that in order to develop PTSD, you have to have experienced a trauma, we also know that not everybody who experiences a trauma develops PTSD. So there's other factors at play as well. It's not as simple as this, so this. We know that some children who are physically abused or some people who are physically abused in childhood grow up and are abusive themselves, and then say, well, you know, that's how I was raised, that's the only way I knew how to do it. There are other people who are physically abused in childhood who make a point of taking parenting classes, learning how to deal with children in a way so that they don't become physically abusive because they remember how awful it felt. And then there are people who fall in between those 2 points. There's no one thing that causes one thing, okay? So that's what we mean by multiply determined. We also have to keep in mind that children and the environment are interdependent. And so what I mean by that is that the way a child acts influences how the environment will respond back to the child, right? It's not just child does this, environment always is exactly the same. So as an example, my oldest nephews are twins, which, let me tell you, as a psychologist, when I found out that there were going to be twins, I was like super excited because I was like my own little learning lab, right? Good little behaviorist was like, and then they turned out to be fraternal, not identical, and I was a little disappointed. I still love them. They're wonderful. I adore them. But that's neither here nor there. But they provide some great examples about how the child and environment are interdependent, because I remember when they were babies, like infants, my brother and sister-in-law would alternate their feeding order. So at their first feeding in the morning, twin A would get fed first, twin B would get fed second. And then for the next feeding, it would be twin B first, twin A second. But the problem is, turns out twin B had a real problem waiting. Twin B has always been Mr. Instant Gratification. When he wants something, he wants it, and he wants it right now. And so while they had in mind this perfectly equitable system where they would alternate who got what and when, twin B was like, if there is milk to be had, I am going to be the one having it. Then my older brother. And so the environment responded because the way he responded to having to wait to be fed was not pleasant. Okay, so the environment has an influence on the child has an influence on the environment. Abnormal development involves continuities and discontinuities. And what I mean by this is that developmental changes can be gradual. And the way something is happening, right? So let's say we're talking about a child who is diagnosed as being on the autism spectrum. There are going to be some aspects of their development that continue along a more neurotypical trajectory, and other things that are going to be fits and starts, and then other things that are going to be part of the autism spectrum diagnosis. And so it's not always just we get from point A to point B, but we kind of meander along the way. Sometimes we go through like a little spurt and then we slow down, or maybe we backtrack. So there are things that are continuous about our development, both normal and abnormal, and also things that happen in fits and starts. Okay. And then, of course, one of the things, this kind of goes with it, that we do have changes that are typical and atypical. We go back and forth. And so, again, thinking about that example I used earlier about my daughter being a little bit handsy in her younger years, like if she was tired and frustrated. Part of it then becomes a bit of a limit testing thing, like, can I hit you or can I bite you? How are you going to react? And then she learns, okay, I shouldn't be doing that. And now it only happens very rarely, but if she's like super, super tired and frustrated, it's more likely to happen, right? So we go back to that behavior, but even though most of the time we don't see that happening. And so things go back and forth, both sort of typical things and atypical things. Okay, where are we here? I had another point on that, so I was a little confused. Oops, and I just moved the sweater over the mic. It's clearly getting to be afternoon here. Okay. Something else that we have to think about is adaptational failure, a failure to master or progress in accomplishing developmental milestones. So one of the things that happens when, pretty much from the moment babies are born, is we know that there are a bunch of milestones that we're expecting them to achieve. So early on, it's things like being able to roll over, being able to sleep at the right times, because when infants are first brand new newborns, their days are nights, their nights are days, and nobody ever sleeps ever. And then eventually they figure it out and they start sleeping. And then as they get a little bit older, they start eating solid food, which we expect to see happen. And then we start seeing them becoming more mobile. We see them first starting by grabbing for things and then working on crawling. Sometimes they army crawl, and then eventually they start to walk. Those are some of those milestones. We then look at milestones in terms of language development, right? We look at them recognizing their name. We look at them being able to speak. We look at how many words they have by certain ages. Those are all different milestones we're looking for. And some children fail to master or progress in achieving some of these developmental milestones. So some children who have a more severe form of autism may be nonverbal. So they may never find their words. They may never use words. That would be an adaptational failure, okay? So those are things that we're looking for. In terms of how development sort of plods along, early patterns of adaptation evolve with structure over time and then transform into higher order functions. So it's that whole, you have to learn how to crawl before you can walk, you have to learn to walk before you can run. That's typically the way it goes. There are sometimes kids who skip one of those phases. So that can happen, but usually we build on what we have first learned. So when we think about something like reading, before a child can learn to read, they have to know what words are. They have to know what their letters are. They have to know what sounds the letters make before they can put that all together and be able to read. So if they missed a step, they might not be able to advance. And that's what we're talking about in terms of these early patterns of adaptation leading to higher order functions. And another thing we have to consider is sensitive periods. Sensitive periods are windows of time during which environmental influences on development are enhanced. So the best time for you to have learned a second language has already long since passed you by. There are some great programs out there like Duolingo and stuff like that, but the best time to learn a second language is actually when you're quite young, when you're preschool aged. That is a sensitive period for language development. Okay, so those are times when we should be able to achieve some tasks And it doesn't mean we can't achieve them later on, they will just be more difficult. It's kind of like if you think about something like riding a bike. Most of you today probably could ride a bike. Some of you probably learned when you were somewhere between the ages of 4 and 7. And that was probably easier than if you waited till 13 to learn how to ride a bike. Because at 13, you're thinking about bigger picture stuff like, first of all, am I going to embarrass myself in front of my friends? Am I going to fall? What if I actually get hurt? What would getting hurt mean? A 5-year-old doesn't think about that. A 5-year-old thinks, cool, bike, bell, shiny, right? And they just go. So that would be a sensitive period for learning to ride a bike with no fear. Just to give you a slightly different example, I don't want all the examples to be mental health stuff. It gets dark pretty quick. Okay, so that was developmental perspective. Focusing now on biological perspective. And again, for those of you who've had me in class before, you know that biological perspective is not going to be my strong suit. Normally, when we're actually live and in class, again, for those of you who've had me before, you know that my office is next to Karen's office, and I'm like, if you have questions about the brain, just go to Karen. So if you have questions about the brain, just email Karen. Okay, so you've all taken brain and behavior, and most of you probably did have Karen, because over the past few years, she has taught the bulk of the B&B classes. So if you have brain questions, Karen's your gal, okay? I mean, I can try, but go to Karen. She knows I say this too. Trust me, every term I'm like, I told my students to go to you. Okay, neural plasticity and the role of experience. Well, when we're talking about neural plasticity, we're talking about malleability. We're talking about how the brain works and how it's going to take in new information. And when we're younger, I'm trying to think of how I distill down this brain stuff into usable bits. And so I'm going to explain it the way that it makes the most sense to me. When we're younger, our brains are actually fuller of not information, but fuller of potential connections and pathways. And what happens is over time, as we learn stuff, as we learn to sequence stuff, those pathways become sort of learned patterns and all the extra fades away. So in like late adolescence, there's a process of pruning that happens in the brain where all the synapses and pathways that we don't need actually get swept away. But so when we're young, where we have more of those potential connections, our brain is a lot more malleable and we can actually shift course more easily because the connections are there to be used. As we get older, it gets harder because things are smoother and more direct. And I hope that kind of makes sense. It's kind of like, and I kind of hate saying this, but I say it every term, so I'll say it even though it's on video, which makes me a little nervous. The best time to get a traumatic brain injury is never. The second best time to get a traumatic brain injury is when you're really, really young and your brain still has all those extra potential connections because it can compensate better. Now, today, if you get a traumatic brain injury, it is not going to be an easy recovery. But if you had it when you were like 2, it'd be a lot easier. So go back in time, have somebody drop you on, no, I'm kidding. Don't go back in time. And don't drop young children on their heads. Just don't do it. I have to be so much more careful on video than I do in a live class. It's really kind of hard. Okay, let's talk about genes. So one of the things that happens is we have this gene-environment interaction. And in the text they write G times E. Genes influence how we respond to the environment, and then the environment influences our genes. Now, that's over time, right? So again, we're thinking big picture. That's not necessarily going to have an impact on us, but on our next generation and next one after that. My daughter actually was recently asking me about like where people came from, and we sort of went in some interesting places in that discussion because she was thinking like timing-wise, and she was thinking caveman, and I was telling her that we were actually descendant from like the same family of like primates. And she was like, really? And I was like, yeah. And so trying to explain to her why we don't have tails any longer. That's the level of gene-environment interaction, right? It doesn't happen in one generation. It takes a while for humans to lose their tails. You guys are like, why did we sign up for this class? That's what usually happens around now. Okay, behavioral genetics investigates possible connections between a genetic predisposition and an observed behavior. So some of the things that we do, and certainly we see this with mental health, we don't know if it's a learned behavior or if it's genetic. And I'm going to just take depression as an example. If a child grows up with a parent who is experiencing major depression, that child is watching that parent and sees that this parent comes home from work and sits down on the couch and is basically a potato lump until the next morning, and then gets up and goes to work again, and doesn't have a lot of enthusiasm, and doesn't show a lot of interest in activities, and doesn't show a lot of interest in other people. And then when that child grows up, that child also sort of goes to work, comes home, watches TV, doesn't socialize much, doesn't get excited about much. Is that a genetic predisposition, or is that a learned behavior? Or is it a little bit from column A and a little bit from column B? That's what we're trying to figure out. So we try to figure out how much of it is a learned behavior, how much of it is a genetic predisposition, how much of it is a genetic predisposition put into the right scenario where that behavior manifests. Twin studies tend to be key for understanding behavioral genetics, and this is again where my disappointment was that my nephews were fraternal or dizygotic twins as opposed to monozygotic, because monozygotic is like this perfect little learning lab, right? DNA is exactly the same. And then it's a question of how the environment influences, but they're no different than any other sibling pair, so I can compare one of them to their younger brother. It just doesn't really matter. I mean, again, I don't mean to be disappointed, but like a little bit. They can never see this video. Just by the way, that's a for sure. But twin studies are really key for this because it lets us see two people whose genes are exactly the same and who often have a shared environment, but then if we compare to a sibling or someone else in that same environment, we can see the environmental influence versus the genetic influence a little bit more clearly. Molecular genetics, on the other hand, directly assess the association between variations in DNA sequences and variations in a particular trait or traits. That's about all you need to know. Like, we are not going to go deep into the biological because it's A, not my forte, and I can admit that, and B, because I'm much more interested in how we see the manifestation and see the behaviors than what's going on that we don't know and don't see. We do have to think a tiny little bit about the neurobiological contributions. Certainly the brain structure and function, frontal lobe is of particular interest. Frontal lobe is where thinking, reasoning, and memory all happen. So certainly as we think about a child developing and learning and growing, those are all really important. Okay. We also have to think about, with kids even more so than adults, the endocrine system, particularly the adrenal glands, pituitary gland, and HPA axis. Again, HPA axis, hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal cortex, and that is the end result of the activation of the HPA axis is the release of cortisol. So that's implicated in stress. And of course, hormones play a large role in a child's development, both from a physical development standpoint, so physical maturity, and also how the changes happen that happen around puberty, which also become very important. It's actually around puberty that we see the first change in rates of depression between boys and girls. Prepubescent children, equal rates of depression, whether they're a boy or a girl. Post-puberty, girls have a much higher rate of depression than boys. So we go, okay. We can see how our society plays into that and what the societal influences are, but it also suggests that there's a hormonal component that we see as people go through puberty. And then, of course, we have our neurotransmitters. And again, these tend to be important when we're thinking about using medication to treat mental health disorders. And certainly with children, we hear a lot about Ritalin and other stimulants being used to treat ADHD. So GABA, gamma-aminobutyric acid, you never have to know it as the full name, GABA is just fine, which is linked to anxiety. Dopamine, which we see linked with schizophrenia. Norepinephrine, which of course we see linked with ADHD, with energy. And then finally serotonin, which we see depression and anxiety responding to that. Serotonin is a regulatory neurotransmitter, so it regulates our dopamine and norepinephrine levels. So if our serotonin is off, it can further knock other things off as well. So again, just something to think about, that when we're looking at children, and I'm certainly not an advocate of let's just medicate children and call it a day, but there is a time and place, and we do have to think about what impact that has on their overall development in addition to treating the mental health disorder. And then we've got our psychological perspectives. We want to think about some of these emotional influences, particularly emotional reactivity and emotional regulation. So some people are just, and you'll know people in your life who are just reactive. Something happens and they just react to it. And other people who are a lot more cautious, who are a lot sort of slower to act, who really think about everything that's going on before they react. And so some people have really good regulation, some people don't have great regulation, some people are very reactive, some people are a lot slower to react. When we're talking about emotion reactivity, we're talking about individual differences in the threshold and intensity of the emotional experience. So some of you may cry with certain commercials on TV. It happens. There are some that are just really good. Usually they have some really good ones around the Olympics, right? Like those thank you mom ones that like make people tear up a little bit. And some of you look at people who cry during commercials and go, seriously? Right? That's talking a little bit about emotion reactivity. When we're talking about emotion regulation, we're talking about enhancing, maintaining, or inhibiting our emotional arousal. So you may know someone who, or have heard the expression like that someone's hot under their collar, so someone who's just a little more quick to react and would perhaps need some help inhibiting their emotional arousal because they just get that way pretty quickly. Okay. And then temperament and early personality styles. And again, I recognize that a lot of this is probably a review from lifespan development and possibly topics in child development, but just bear with me, please. So temperament is a child's organized style of behavior. And what we typically see are 3 different types of temperaments. We see children who exhibit positive affect and approach. And this is sort of like our easygoing child, right? So we think about a child who in a new environment just sort of like takes it all in and then jumps right in. We then have our fearful or inhibited child, who also can be described as slow to warm. They walk into a new situation and they're sort of hanging, I can't go over to the wall because I'll pass the tape, but they're kind of hanging back. Yeah, there's a piece of tape on the floor to tell me not to go too far that way. So they're kind of hanging back, they're looking at everything. They're kind of like, okay, here's what's going on in here. I guess it's maybe safe to come out now. So I guess I can come out and try things out, but they're going to be a little bit slower to warm up. And then once they're comfortable, boom, they're good to go. And then finally, children whose temperament is more guided by negative affect or irritability. And these are who we would typically call like the more difficult child, right? So a child who's just a little more negative, a little more irritable, harder to get along with, really struggles with change and with new situations. So we've arrived at the point of your first reflection question. So I'll bring the question up, I'll read it, and then you can go ahead and pause. And after you've answered it, come on back and hit play. So for each type of temperament on the previous page or previous slide, please state whether you think their emotional reactivity and emotional regulation would be high, moderate, or low, and briefly explain why. This is probably a good point to add that these reflection questions are meant to make you think a little. They're not just like, what did I just talk about? Sorry. Okay. So you've had a chance to reflect. We have 2 more perspectives to consider, and that'll round out chapter 2. So psychological perspectives, we certainly have to think about behavioral and cognitive influences. So our behaviors and the behaviors of people around us as well as how we think about things. So our cognitive influences are how we think about things. Those are going to impact our behavior and the development potentially of any disorders. And then we have applied behavior analysis, which is known as a functional approach to behavior that's very much based on positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, extinction, and punishment. And so you might be thinking, hey, I've heard about that before. Yeah, you have. This all has to do with our operant conditioning, right? So ABA is based on operant conditioning principles. And ABA has been used a lot with children, particularly children on the autism spectrum, children with other behavior disorders. There has been some success with ABA therapy. There's some controversy around it, as well as with anything in psychology, pretty much. But what we really want to work on when we're trying to help a child who's struggling with some behavior is we want to really encourage them and positively reinforce appropriate behaviors. We want to ignore in an attempt to extinguish negative behaviors. We want to be really careful with negative reinforcement. This is something that parents often get in trouble with and teachers often get in trouble with, because negative reinforcement is when we actually end up giving the child attention, which is what they want, for a behavior that we actually don't want them engaging in. And so it's a tricky balance. First of all, we always want to make sure that we're keeping children safe. So if they're doing something dangerous, we don't want to not stop them because we don't want to reinforce the behavior by giving them attention. We always want to stop children from doing something dangerous. But we also have to be careful. And same thing with punishment. We often think of punishment as something that's going to change behavior, but what punishment does is it shuts things down, but it doesn't teach a new behavior. So we want to make as much use of positive reinforcement as we can, thinking also from those operant conditioning terms, shaping and successive approximation. Those are all pieces that we want to build into that puzzle to help with behavior. We can also approach things from a classical conditioning standpoint. So again, where we pair things often enough that the child then has a response to the initial neutral stimulus. And also pretty important with children is going to be social learning and cognition. So social learning, and sorry, this is where the screen is a little bit of a different size and fit, so that last point is going to disappear a little on you. But social learning, children can learn from watching others. So if my daughter at daycare, when she was at daycare, really wanted a toy that someone else was playing with, but another child walked up to that child, so they had like little bikes in the outside playground. So my daughter wants the bike, but Joe is on it, and she's about to walk over to Joe and push him to get him off the bike, but Mike does that first. Mike walks over to Joe, gives Joe a shove, Joe falls down, starts crying, Mike pedals away on the bike, and the teachers stop Mike, physically remove him from the bike, and they go and they, discipline him. And of course, another teacher goes and comforts Joe. My daughter has just watched all that, and she's like, I'm going to go play in the dollhouse. I'm not going to try taking the bike, right? She's going to learn from watching someone else. But that can work in more positive ways also, right? So we oftentimes, when we can, we try to pair a younger child with an older child in the hopes that the older child will model some behavior that we want the younger child to learn. Social cognition relates to how children think of themselves and others. So it's not just thinking of themselves. In that first example, right? So again, Joe's on the bike, my daughter wants it, Mike wants it too, Mike goes and pushes Joe. That's an opportunity for a teacher, or let's say I observed it, it was at pickup time, to say to my daughter, okay, well, how do you think Mike was feeling and how do you think Joe felt when Mike pushed him? And getting her to think about how people would feel about it in the hopes that she would behave appropriately the next time. Okay, and then finally, family, social, and cultural perspectives. So one of the things we have to think about from a family perspective, and also to some extent social, is this concept of shared environment and non-shared environment. So a shared environment is environmental factors that produce similarities in development outcomes among siblings in the same family. And non-shared environment are environmental factors that produce behavioral differences among siblings. Okay, so we have shared factors and we have non-shared factors when we have more than one child in a family. So for example, I will share something that my mom was always, when my brother and I were little, she was always a fan of us getting books as presents. She always bought us books as presents. Like no holiday went by where we weren't rewarded with books. And she said to me once as an adult, she said that nothing gives her better joy than walking into either my bedroom or my brother's bedroom and seeing our nightstands piled with books. She feels sad that neither of us has enough time to read as much as we would like, but she's so happy to see that part of our environment growing up, where books were such a critical part, are something that we now both experience. Okay, and so that was a shared thing. We've both developed a tremendous love of reading as a result of that. Interestingly, one of my nephews, who sort of same influence, lots of books, he doesn't like reading. Getting him to read is like you practically have to strap him down and put the book in his hand and pry his eyes open to get him to read. And so that, there's a bit of a difference there. Part of it was his brother, his twin brother loves to read and was always praised for reading. And he sort of took that as, okay, well, I need to get attention for something different because they're giving him the praise for reading, so I'm gonna not read, right? And I don't know that he had that cognitive and conscious thought, but that's how it kind of translates. And so again, same environment produces different outcome for siblings. We have to also consider infant and caregiver attachment. So attachment refers to the process of establishing and maintaining an emotional bond with parents or caregivers. You probably in your developmental courses prior to this have learned about that, and also how temperament can also be a factor in attachment. Certainly a child who's pretty easygoing is going to be somewhat easier for a parent to develop a secure attachment with. But we do look at how attached the infant is to the primary caregiver. And then of course, thinking a little bit wider, the family and peer context. Obviously the family system plays a role, and here's where culture also comes in as well. We can never neglect thinking about culture, and we'll talk about that more when we talk about assessment and the importance of considering culture. But even who makes up your family, when I say something like family system plays a role, what are we talking about? Are we talking about a family system of mom, dad, and siblings? Or are we talking about grandparents or maybe aunts and uncles or cousins who also live in the family home? Are we talking about our family as a bigger piece of our community, maybe a religious community or a cultural group that we affiliate with where everybody's an auntie, right? So we have to think about what family means for our client, for the child that we're working with. Okay, that is chapter 2. So again, just a brief overview. Again, a lot of it was review. We're going to go ahead and continue on with chapter 3, which was the next part of today's content. So this is now the chapter about research. And again, what you're thinking is, oh, we've talked about research time and again. And you're right. This chapter is largely review. All of you at this stage have taken research methods and have covered this material multiple times. So I am not going to be spending a lot of time on it. I have 3 slides. That's it. Okay. But you are still responsible for reading the whole chapter in the textbook. And you're thinking, reading? What? Yeah. A quick word about reading. Do it. Okay? Just do it. You are responsible for the readings I assign. We will have better discussions in the discussion component of class if you have done the readings. The first half of this chapter, or the first half of this class is heavier on reading than the second half. So just try and bear with it. So, quick review. So this is what's all in the text and what I'm really not going to talk about, but that you are still expected to be familiar with. Scientific approach, research process, methods of studying behavior, and research strategies. That's what you would have already covered through your research methods and other similar classes. So I don't really want to spend time there. What I do want to spend a bit of time on are some ethical and pragmatic issues. And something that you possibly have not given a whole lot of thought to is informed consent and assent. Now, we talk a lot, especially at a university, about informed consent for research projects. And all of you who have participated in research projects through being part of the psychology participant pool when you were taking intro, or who have been working as a research assistant with one of the faculty members down in the lab, or even doing your honors or directed reading projects, you think a lot about informed consent, right? And how we have to get people to consent to participate in a research study. And of course, when we're talking about children, anybody under the age of 18, or anybody who is deemed who needs to have a legal guardian consent for them, it's the parent or the legal guardian who gives consent. So, for example, there was a call that went out probably about a month and a half ago. University of Calgary is participating, well, U of C and the Alberta Children's Hospital is participating in a children's serology study related to COVID. And I was like, oh yeah, I didn't talk to my daughter, I just signed her up. We didn't get selected, which is probably good because she might not have wanted to do it, although I'm sure I could have talked her into it. But ultimately, I decided I wanted her, if she could participate, to do it. And ultimately, I'm the person who consents. Now, that being said, the researchers would still be asking her if she agreed. And if she says no, the respectful thing is for me to go, okay, she doesn't want to do it. And for the researchers to say, okay, she doesn't want to do it, she's not going to do it. We have to always try to obtain assent or assent from the child as well. And depending on their age and ability, we have to go with that, okay? So assent is when the child shows some form of agreement to participate, generally when age 7 or older. So again, my daughter is only 5, so technically, it's a gray area, but it didn't happen, so it doesn't matter. In order to get a child to assent, though, you have to put it into terms they understand. So think about those consent forms that you filled out before for research studies. Think about even the 7 screens before doing an online survey where you're agreeing to this, that, and the other thing, and that the data is going to live on SurveyMonkey's a server which is in the US, so it's not governed by the same laws as the law. You can't present that to a 7-year-old. So you have to think about what is the critical information that this 7-year-old has to know about what we're asking them to do and whether they want to do it or not, and what's going to happen. And that's how we do it. We also, of course, when we're thinking about ethics and pragmatic issues, we do want people to be participating on a voluntary basis. So one of the issues here has to do with, particularly with families, when we're wanting to do social service research, there is perceived pressure, even if there is technically no pressure. So a family who's receiving some sort of services, if they're approached to participate in a study about their child, they may be more likely to say yes, even if they don't want to, because they're worried that they might lose some sort of benefit or service if they say no. So it's really important to be transparent. It's really important for people to know that saying yes or no isn't going to impact their child's health care or services at school or occupational therapy. It's just, if they would like to participate, great, but if they don't want to, there's no problem. And then, of course, we have the issues with confidentiality and anonymity. Here we run into a little bit of trouble because, theoretically, for anybody under the age of 18, their parent is the one who holds the legal right. So technically, if you have a 16-year-old in therapy and they tell you that they're pregnant and they want to have an abortion and they don't want their parents to know, if the parents flat out ask you, is my child pregnant and considering an abortion, good luck, because the parents are the legal holders of privilege. And so technically, if they wanted to fight it in court, they could, but I can also tell you that I would make them fight it in court to find out. when you're working with adolescents, while the parents are the legal holder of privilege, you're not going to have an adolescent be honest with you unless they know that you're not reporting everything back to their parents. And so when I've worked with adolescents before, the agreement I've come to with parents is that anything that I think they need to know about, I will be encouraging their child to tell them. And if their child doesn't tell them, then I will. But that they have to trust the process and let it kind of happen between me and their child, or we're not going to get anywhere. There is also in Alberta, for a teenager, for some issues, they can be considered old enough to consent without parental permission. It just depends on their maturity and their age. So that it's not a blank, like, oh, at 15 you can essentially be an emancipated minor. There are other factors that you have to consider as well. At the end of the day, we have to follow whatever the local laws are for mandated reporting. So if somebody discloses that they're a threat to themselves, a threat to someone else, that they're being abused, we have to keep in mind mandated reporting. Psychologists, teachers, social workers are all mandated reporters, and there's a process to follow if that's disclosed. Now, what you'll see is there is an article that I'd like you to read. It's on Blackboard. It's called A Right to Confidentiality or a Duty to Disclose, Ethical Guidance for Conducting Prevention Research with Children and Adolescents. It's not terribly long. It's on Blackboard, but I think it will certainly tie into this and help us have a good discussion. I also neglected to mention earlier that there is also another article. This is more related to Chapter 2, correcting the record on Watson Rayner and Little Albert. So many of you have learned about Little Albert. He was the little boy who was made afraid of white things with a white rat in John Watson's lab. And so this was published in 2014 in the American Psychologist, and it's just another thought. The most important part of this article for you to read is the discussion, in particular the epilogue. So but again, this is on Blackboard as well, and I'd like us to be discussing it when we have our discussion component. At this point, I do have a reflection question for you as well. So again, this is the first question for this chapter, but it's the second one from today's topics, which is why it says reflection question 2. How would you get assent from a 7-year-old for an educational assessment, so for testing? So imagining that you want to do an IQ test with a 7-year-old for assessment purposes, write out a brief script of what information you would give them and how they would indicate assent. Okay, and then finally, with our ethical, this is our last slide on this chapter, our ethical and pragmatic issues, last things to consider, non-harmful procedures. We also need to use the least stressful procedure. So that's something that we need to think about. So again, we think about from the ethics perspective, we always want to be respecting people's rights and dignity. We want to do good and do no harm. So we really want to be as non-harmful and as least stressful as possible. So if you're having a child coming in for testing, maybe you encourage them or you remind their parents that they can bring their favorite stuffy with them. And maybe you have like another chair next to theirs for them to put their stuffy on, right? So it becomes a little bit more comforting. I'm looking around the room that I'm in right now. I'm over in T-Wing in the academic media group, and it's a great room for our purposes for filming today, but I'm trying to imagine if I was doing 3 hours of testing in here with a kid. No, right? So how do we make it more comfortable? Do we provide like kid-size furniture so they can be comfortable? Do we, instead of having those like boring yellow pencils, do we have, you know, superhero and Frozen and, you know, pencils that are things that they're interested in? So again, how do we make it less stressful for them, more comfortable? Can we let their parents stay with them, or do we need their parent out of the room? Things like that, and that's what we want to be thinking about. And then other things that we need to think about, so other ethical and pragmatic concerns, pretty much the Human Research Ethics Board. So here at MRU, we just call it HREB. But they are the governing body who reviews all research protocols, and they will be, at any institution, they will be the guiding force in determining what needs to happen, and especially with kids. So one of the sort of unique challenges with children is how do you keep them motivated and interested, right? So an adult in 2 hours or 3 hours of testing, how do you keep them motivated and interested? So do we have to provide snacks? Do we need to have an appropriate break for snacks? Do we encourage them to bring a snack from home? Do we break up the testing into multiple days, figuring, half an hour a day instead of 3 hours all at once? So those are some of the things that we do have to think about, and that's something where, particularly with a research protocol, HREB is going to guide you right through that. So here we go. This is the last segment for this week's class, Assessment, Diagnosis, and Treatment, and this is Chapter 4. And so again, some of this will be a little bit of a review because some of you have already taken Psych 4485, which talks about assessment. You also might have heard about assessment in counseling if you took it. Probably not that much in 2285, but again, we're going to focus specifically on children and some of the things we do with children for assessment purposes. So the first thing we have to think about really is, okay, is this a mental health problem, right? So the thing with children is bad behavior or undesirable behavior is not always indicative of a mental health problem. Kids are kids. As a parent, I feel fairly confident saying a lot of times kids are little shits, right? It's just who they are, it's what they do. Is that indicative of a mental health problem is the question, right? So we have to think about, again, what developmental stage are they at? How old are they? What's their environment like? What are their risk factors? And part of how we're going to decide if it's a mental health problem and if it's a mental health problem that requires help is by going through assessment. That's going to guide our decision-making process. So this is where the whole, I jump ahead of what's on my points. I do this in class all the time too. Those of you who've had me before know that. So we have to consider age, gender, culture, right? So these developmental considerations as part of, is this behavior, is it appropriate? Is it not so appropriate? Is it not inappropriate but just less desirable? Or is it sort of way off, different from what we would normally expect from a child of the same age, same gender, same culture? Okay. And so that's where it's also really helpful for us to have normative information. And so sometimes we look at sort of that more global, what do children this age do? What do children of this gender or this culture do? But also getting some information, particularly in a family situation. So sometimes parents, through no fault of their own, and trust me, parents are not perfect by any stretch, they do the best with what they have, will have a child, their first child often, who might have some issues on either the autism spectrum or maybe have some issues with ADHD that have gone completely unrecognized until the child starts school, simply because the parents had nothing to compare the child to, right? So their first child was like a ton of energy, was like bouncing around all the time, and maybe it's their only child. So they never realized, they just thought, well, that's what Johnny's like, right? And then Johnny starts school and the teacher's like, oh my goodness, is Johnny a handful or what? Right? Because he's busy bouncing off the walls and doing all that. And the parents are like, well, we just thought he had high energy. Or they then have a second child and little Sam is just like, he listens. When you ask him to clean up his room, he does. And the parents are like, why didn't Johnny do any of that? So stuff that they just dismissed as, well, that's just Johnny. Once they have some more normative information, whether it's from school, whether it's from a sibling, they go, oh, maybe there was something with Johnny all along, but it was just never an issue. And I think that's a really important piece to remember, is that parents certainly don't look, and I say this as a parent, I don't look at my daughter and think, gosh, what on earth could possibly be wrong with you? And start running through a list of things that I think could be wrong that I need to rule out. If something comes up and it presents as an issue, we deal with it, but otherwise we just sort of go, well, that's just her. And kids have their quirks, right? Like they have their shtick. They want things a certain way. They like to do things a certain way. And that's just them, and it's not necessarily a problem. So it's really hard without some of that normative information to know, is this just my kid or is there something wrong? And that's, again, where professional and assessment comes in and plays a role. So the purposes of assessment, there's two big ones. Description and diagnosis, so understanding what's going on and whether there's a diagnosis, and then also prognosis and treatment planning. And I think a lot of times when we think about assessment, we think about the first part a lot. We think about that description and diagnosis. We want to arrive at what is the problem or what label can we give it to help it make more sense. But what parents and children really want to know is, what's the prognosis and what's treatment going to look like? What does this mean for my child, right? So when your child isn't feeling well, or for you guys even as adults yourselves, when you're not feeling well, you go to the doctor and you want the doctor to tell you what's wrong. And part of why you want a name for what's wrong or to have an idea of what's wrong is so that you know how to make it go away and how to get better, right? If you have an arm, you've fallen and your arm is hanging at a weird angle, you don't want to go to the doctor and have the doctor say, yeah, I've seen that before. And you're like, okay, well, like, is it broken? And they're like, well, you know, it's definitely not where it should be, right? And they're just not giving you a firm answer. If they're like, well, we should probably cast it. And you're like, well, for how long? And they're like, I don't know, come back in like, I don't know, 7-8 weeks and we'll check it out and see. And you're like, no, give me more of a plan of what this is going to look like. And that's oftentimes the part that we're less focused on because we're so much more curious about getting to that diagnosis. The parents want that too, but the parents care less about, most likely, not all, about the formal name than they want to know what's going to happen next. Is my child going to be okay? Do we have services? Do we have a plan in place that is going to help my child grow, thrive, and succeed? Because that's what parents want for their kids. They don't need a mental health label. They need to know that we have a plan for how their child is going to thrive. So that's a really important piece of assessment and shouldn't be the afterthought of assessment. Okay, so how do we assess? Well, we start with clinical interviews. And with children, we are often going to interview the child, the parents, depending on what's happening or who else is involved in their life in terms of caregiving. We will talk to that person. We might talk to siblings depending on what's happening. So oftentimes we'll have like the whole family come in together for an assessment, and then we'll talk to parents separately, and even each parent separately depending on what's happening, the child themselves, and then possibly sibling or other caregiver, whether there's a nanny, a grandparent, a babysitter, whoever else is involved substantially with the child's care. We're also going to engage in behavioral assessment, which is basically a fancy way of saying observation. We want to see how the child acts. So some of you are aware, some of you aren't. In the Center for Psychological Innovation, so the lab in the psychology building, we do have a family room, and we've got toys and we've got books and stuff like that, but we also have a one-way mirror, so we can see how the child interacts with their parents without the experimenter in the room or the psychologist in the room, right? And so we can actually see what happens. We could have the child and the sibling, if that's where the issue is, and see how they interact without us being in the room with them, because they'll often act differently if an adult's in the room with them. And then we can also use formal psychological testing. This is going to depend on what we're looking for and how old the child is, but there's different things that we can do. So developmental testing, which is really for infants and very young children, which we're evaluating their development. We're looking at those milestones, so things like for an infant rolling over, being able to grip something, being able to mimic someone's face. So if you smile at a baby, they smile back at you, things like that. Intelligence testing, which does exist for young children. It's not as reliable or accurate, but starting around school age, the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for children is quite reliable. And then, of course, there's the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, the WAIS, which is the predominant IQ test that's used out there these days. There's also the Stanford Binet. Projective testing, so this is from the land of Papa Freud, where we would present, usually with children, we use the children's apperception test, which is the children's version of the thematic apperception test, where we have pictures and we ask people, or in this case children, to tell a story about what's happening. So it's not quite as abstract as Rorschach's ink blots. Those are pretty abstract, and there's a very complicated scoring mechanism. I believe it's the Wexner scoring system. I'm not trained in that. I'm not trained in administering the TAT or the CAT either, but those are actual pictures, and you ask the child to tell a story about what's happening, and that gives you some insight into what's going on. We can also do personality testing, which is largely things like looking at the 5-factor model, right? So openness, conscientiousness, agreeableness, neuroticism, and extroversion. And finally, if the need is there, we can do neuropsych testing as well. So if we're concerned about memory, if we're concerned about stuff specific to one hemisphere or the other, we can certainly look at some of that sort of testing. A quick word about just backtracking for a second to intelligence testing. Our IQ tests, so both the WISC and the WAIS, so the Wechsler Intelligence Scales for Adults and Children, they're highly correlated to school intelligence, so things you would learn in school, and also very much developed and normed for your more traditional, like middle to upper class white American. So anybody who is not that may not score as well. Does that truly reflect that they're not intelligent? Or is that a cultural bias within the test? So that's just something to think about. But at the same time, it's really hard to assess intelligence, and the Wechsler has been around for so long, and it's sort of are we doing the best we can with what we have, or is there something better out there? And this leads us to reflection question number 1 for this segment, but number 3 for today's lectures, because again, today was chapters 2, 3, and 4. So given the problems with intelligence testing, how could IQ or intelligence be assessed in a less biased manner? Okay, so now that you've had a chance to answer that, we are going to talk a little more about classification and diagnosis. So essentially, we use the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition, or the DSM-5, for our classification purposes. And I want to draw your attention. I do want to draw your attention to the way this is written out. If you are writing something for this class, or any other class for that matter, especially because some of you are currently enrolled in 4485 as well, the first time you cite the DSM, you write out the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And I actually made a mistake because I should have a comma, 5th edition written there as well. And then in parentheses, you put DSM-5, and it's the number 5. DSM is tricky like that because up through DSM-4 TR, it was Roman numerals, and then they decided to get all modern and actually just do a number 5 for DSM-5. Please make sure you are citing the DSM correctly. We talk about the DSM being the Bible of the world of clinical psychology. You wouldn't cite the Bible incorrectly, so please cite the DSM correctly, okay? Now, the thing about the DSM to keep in mind is that it is, by and large, a categorical document. So we talk about categories and dimensions. Categories are when we say, okay, do you have the symptom? Yes, no. And if yes, you go into this category. If no, you go into this category. Dimensions are when we're saying, okay, well, how much of the symptom do you have? And so DSM-5 has made a little bit of progress in moving to a bit of a dimensional model for autism spectrum disorder. That's now considered on a spectrum. So that's that dimension, and we rate how severe a person is, as opposed to having different diagnoses of Asperger's disorders, pervasive developmental disorder, autism disorder, right? We now say it's autism spectrum, and we rate the severity. But by and large, the DSM is still a categorical diagnostic system where it's, do you have the symptoms? Do you have the right number? Yes, therefore you go into this category of major depressive disorder or obsessive compulsive disorder. In the DSM-5, the disorders of childhood are classified as neurodevelopmental disorders. In DSM, like up to DSM-5, so DSM-4, DSM-4-TR, it was disorders usually first diagnosed in infancy, childhood, and adolescence. So neurodevelopmental disorders is certainly a little less cumbersome to say. And it does reflect that a lot of these disorders from childhood, we now have a better understanding of, well, still not a full understanding, but a better understanding of the fact that they are typically things that are happening in the child's brain, things that aren't either processing properly or processing differently. And so that's where that neuro piece comes in. And of course, the developmental reflecting the fact that they usually happen earlier in childhood and into adolescence. One of the things that I'd like us to talk about, so I want you to think about a little bit, is, what are the benefits towards having a system like the DSM? What are the drawbacks? So what are the pros and cons of the DSM, essentially? And we'll talk about that when we're live in discussion later on in the week. Okay, in terms of treatment and prevention, so one of the things that we think about, of course, is intervention. And intervention can take many different forms, and it can also be in many different settings. So, again, as a clinical psychologist, and for you guys as psychology students, we think intervention, we often think therapy. And we think therapist, one child. But that's not the way it always works best. Group therapy or even group sort of supportive skills groups can be really beneficial for children. Family therapy, sometimes even intervention right in the classroom, so having an aide working with them in the classroom, particularly if it's behavioral outburst type of stuff. So there's lots of different modalities. We might also find, and this one might be surprising to you, if children are behaving badly in class, one of the first things that we want to make sure of is that they've had their hearing and their vision checked. Because if a child's sitting in a classroom all day and can't hear or can't see, of course they're going to act out. They're bored out of their mind and they're frustrated. So sometimes the easiest fix is taking them for an eye exam and discovering that they need glasses. And then boom, behavior problems go away. So we want to make sure that we're not automatically thinking all the time, oh my God, we have to take a child to a therapist, right? They need therapy. No, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they need to make a new friend. Sometimes they need glasses. Sometimes it's low blood sugar and they just need to eat more often. Because let me tell you, when kids get hangry, they get hangry, right? It is unpleasant. And so one of the things that I will say, my daughter often does not get that way, but there are times when her behavior, I just look at her and I throw a granola bar at her. I don't even give it to her. I'm afraid. But then it's oh, she's suddenly a pleasant person again. And I'm sure you guys feel the same. Right now, I wish I could just throw granola bars at each of you through the screen, right? Because it's getting late in the day for both me and Caleb sitting here doing this. And I don't know, now it's oh, granola bar. So Caleb's I kind of want one too. Sorry. So we have to think about intervention a little bit differently and how it might look different with children. Can also be prevention can be a form of intervention. So when we know that a child's at risk for something, whether it's because there's a family history of a disorder or a child who has had something tragic happen in their life, providing them with some support before there's a problem can actually reduce the likelihood of there being a problem. And then we can also, especially with children, think about the maintenance phase of treatment, which is after active treatment is finished. We might still have periodic check-ins or periodic meetings to see how they're still doing and sort of tweak things a little bit if need be. And that'll be something later on in the term we're going to watch a movie where that becomes a lot more, oh, it's a documentary, don't get so excited. It's not you're not going to want popcorn with it. But where they talk about the maintenance of this child, his name is Evan, his treatment and where maybe things went a little sideways there. Okay, we also have to consider culture, always, always, always. We have to consider the cultural pattern of the parents and the family. We have to think about, what is and isn't accessible. There are some groups of people who still have a lot of stigma surrounding mental health and surrounding going for help and getting treatment. So we want to be maybe a little more cognizant of that and maybe not talk about it as treatment. Maybe that's where we couch it more as it's some extra skills learning. It's some extra support, right? We don't use the word treatment because we want to get buy-in. We also have to think about how accessible are we, right? So if my private practice office is in downtown Calgary, but I specialize in working with children who are refugees from war-torn countries, good luck. They don't live in downtown Calgary. They don't live in the Beltline, right? I need to be heading more out towards either the far northeast or possibly more forest lawn, but they're not coming to downtown Calgary, and I'm not expecting a parent and a child to ride the C train for 45 minutes to come to a therapy appointment. So where are we physically located? What's our fee structure like in terms of accessibility? What's our office like in terms of accessibility, right? Is it a warm, inviting place for a child, or is it like this room that I'm in right now? So those are some of the things that we have to think about. With also the cultural considerations, you know, it might be that for parents to take their child to a psychologist just goes against so much that they believe in. Maybe setting up shop in the same office as a social service that they might be visiting. So it's not as stigmatizing as going to see the psychologist, right? It's just another piece of it. So those are all things that we definitely need to think about, and also how the family structure can impact what's going on for the child. In terms of treatment goals, with children it's always a little bit different. So when adult clients come in, they typically will say what their treatment goal is, right? So someone who's experiencing depression wants to be less depressed. They want to see themselves getting together with friends more, you know, being more productive at work, having better relationships. It's like, okay, they've identified these goals, fantastic. Children aren't always aware that there's something going on that needs some tweaking. They don't necessarily always know what the goals are themselves. And so what we have to balance out are, what are the parents' goals? What are the child's identified goals? And also thinking about things like outside of the family unit, like school performance, extracurricular performance, social stuff, also sometimes juvenile justice. A lot of times kids come for therapy when the juvenile justice system tells them to go for therapy. So what are the goals from that perspective as well? So we're dealing with more than one stakeholder. When an adult comes for therapy, we have one stakeholder, unless they're mandated by the judicial system, because that happens too. So we have to think about multiple treatment goals and whose goals, if we have to prioritize them, what do we prioritize? And then finally, some ethical and legal considerations. Obviously, we have to follow the ethics code. I've already mentioned the fact that the legal holder of privilege for a child under the age of 18 is the parent, so we do have to be aware of that. But we also do have to get assent from children if they're 7 or older in particular. And I want to also just mention that as we think about this, we have to be a little more careful when we're working with children about sort of going rogue. So with adults, we sometimes might have an idea for something, to try something different in therapy. Maybe what we've been doing isn't really working and we're like, okay, we're gonna just got this idea off the top of my head. Let's treat it like a little like experiment, not a formal experiment, but like let's just see what happens. You don't wanna go rogue with kids, right? With kids, if you're gonna go rogue, you have to have a pretty solid plan for going rogue. Because again, children are different, and we have to remember that children are not miniature adults. So what works with an adult is not necessarily going to work with a child. You know, I often began when I was in private practice, I would begin a therapy session with like, you know, so what do you want to talk about today? And I could see an 8-year-old looking at me going, nothing. I'm only here because my parents made me. Well, now what do I do? Right? Like there's my nice opening. With adults usually it's like, well, I thought I wanted to talk about this, but I actually think maybe we should talk about that. But you know, last time you asked this question and it really made me think, and the kid's like, nothing. I don't want to be here. Okay, so now what? Right? And I've had that happen with adults when they were mandated to come. And I can remember it was actually a student athlete I was working with whose coach required them to come for therapy because there had been an incident with the team. Anyway, long story, we're not going there. And eventually I looked at this athlete and I said, listen, you know the only thing I have to report to coach is whether you came or not. You're here. Because that was how our confidentiality agreement was, that anything that came up in therapy was completely confidential, but coach had to know if the athletes were keeping their appointments, which seemed fair because coach was also paying for the appointments. So the athlete looks at me and is like, well, I don't want to be here. I said, well, but you're here. So here's the thing. I can now tell coach you came. You can now decide how you want to spend the next 45 minutes. We could sit here and stare at each other. I can ask you a bunch of questions that you will give me one-word answers to or not answer, or we can each find better things to do with our time. They stood up and walked out, and I reported to coach that they were there. And that was okay because I can't force an adult to sit and talk. But what if that wasn't an athlete, but that was a child who was 11 and whose parents had just taken time off work to drive them to my office and had just written me a check for $200. Can I let the kid just walk out? No, but I also can't force them to talk, right? So we have to think about things a little bit differently with kids when we're doing treatment, and we have to also think about some of those other factors, like if the child is really not opening up to me, do I tell the parents, listen, maybe you need to try someone else because I feel like you're just wasting time and money with me. Not good for business for me, but from an ethical standpoint, is that the better move? Yeah, it is. Okay. And then okay. See, I did have a note that said next slide, but I didn't write down what was on the next slide. I do that to myself, guys. And I even just reviewed this all last night and was like, right, that's there. So this is table 4.8 from the 6th edition of the text. In the 7th edition, it's table 4.9 and page 113. And so these are just some of the core ethical issues in clinical work with children and families. I don't feel like I need to read the whole list to you because I've just given you the exact page number of where you can find it in your textbook, presuming you have a textbook. And this is also in the PowerPoints that you have. But again, it's things we just really have to think about, that it's not just the child that we're thinking about, but we do have to think about the adults in the child's life, the parents, who's paying for therapy, all these different things that factor in. And so finally, in terms of whoops, I went backwards instead of forwards. Yeah, clearly we're at the end of our filming day. General approaches to treatment. We will be exploring different treatment modalities and types of therapy throughout the term. Things like psychodynamic, behavioral, cognitive behavioral, client-centered, family, neurobiological, and particularly when we think neurobiological, we're thinking about medication and possibly electroconvulsive shock treatment, and combination treatments, right? So sometimes treatments work best when we have two of them working at the same time, not just one. And then in terms of treatment effectiveness, we really want to focus on evidence-based treatment. And I say that, but then I also add the caveat that most evidence-based treatment is cognitive in nature, because cognitive therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy is the easiest one to manualize and study, and therefore it has the most evidence. Because you can follow a fairly strict structure with do this in the first session, do this in the second, do this in the third. From a psychodynamic perspective, when you're saying, let's discover what the root of your unconscious is, well, there's no manual for that. There's no structure to that in terms of something that we can do the exact same thing or ask the exact same questions of multiple people. So we do want to keep in mind that we want to use evidence-based as much as we can, but also recognize that evidence-based does not cover all of the different theoretical orientations, and sometimes you need someone who's working out of a different box. Okay. The typical child in treatment is going to do better than if they didn't receive treatment. So that's, again, therapy is not going to be the fix for everyone, and that's true of adults and children. But in general, if a child is having a mental health issue, they will do better with treatment than if we just let it go. So that's something to keep in mind. And that seems to hold for both short-term and long-term. And I think that's another piece to really think about with children, that if we can intervene earlier, we can set them up for longer-term success. The longer we wait to intervene, the harder it's going to be to break the patterns that are already there. Okay, so with that, I just want to remind you again, I had referenced earlier the 2 articles that I want you to read before our discussion. So again, Correcting the Record on Watson, Rayner, and Little Albert, and A Right to Confidentiality or a Duty to Disclose. Both of those are posted on Blackboard. thus concludes chapter 4. I'll see you guys for discussion, and yeah, we'll get some more videos made soon.